Welcome to Unbound, the podcast with Beth Curry, author, storyteller, and survivor. This is where books meet real life, where Beth reads chapters from her work and breaks free from the traditional audiobook format, diving deeper into the personal experiences, lessons, and liberation behind every page. Nothing is off limits. Let's get unbound.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Unbound Season 3. I'm Beth Curry, and this is Episode 1 from the other side of quiet. I'm not going to bore you with a bunch of pre-dialogue this season, maybe except for this particular episode. At least I don't think so, but I do want to point out something I don't think I mentioned last episode. Throughout the chapter, I do these little asides, and because I don't know how that's going to translate here on the podcast, we tested a couple of different things for how to handle them. If you're reading along with the book or manuscript, please know that I will be incorporating all of the asides in my post-chapter commentary instead, and not necessarily word for word. Also, at the end of many of the chapters, I have a section called What's Actually True, and then kind of like a permission slip situation, but I will read those at the end of the chapter as well, but before the post-chapter commentary that I have after each chapter, so that it can be kind of differentiated, if that makes sense. I'm sure I've confused you all. I think my sound engineer is going to do a little bit of work on the episodes as well, which may actually help divide some of this up because of how I wrote each chapter. We'll see how it goes, though, so I guess I will get started. This is Chapter 1, The First Mark. This wasn't just about a virus. It was about the virus of silence, and I'd lived with that one my whole fucking life. In the early weeks of the pandemic, I watched the world go into lockdown. But for me, the most unsettling shift wasn't physical isolation. It was the sudden, eerie quiet of what we were allowed to say. I remember scrolling late into the night, like everyone else, hungry for answers, connection, anything that made sense. But I also started noticing how quickly certain questions disappeared. Certain voices went missing. Posts vanished, videos were flagged, accounts suspended. At first I thought it was just a glitch or maybe necessary moderation, but the pattern was unmistakable. Disagreement was dangerous. Dissent was seemingly being erased. And the strangest thing, it didn't feel unfamiliar. It felt exactly like my childhood. I knew that feeling, the sharpness of unspoken rules, the look someone gives you when you say too much, the shame that follows a question no one wants you to ask. I'd grown up with that. In my family, in church, in the unsaid things that ran loud. We didn't call it censorship back then. We called it being respectful, private, obedient. But the message was the same. Stay quiet. Don't challenge the narrative. Don't make anyone uncomfortable, especially not the people in charge. So when I saw the world silencing people in real time, not just fringe voices, but anyone who didn't color inside the newly drawn lines, something cracked open in me. It wasn't just fear I was feeling. It was recognition. The post I wrote wasn't radical. Hell, it wasn't even political. I'd been watching the data on kids and mental health during lockdowns, seeing suicide rates spike, watching my own teenager struggle. So I asked what felt like the most reasonable question in the world. At what point do we weigh the mental health costs to our kids against the other risks? Genuine question. I'm seeing some scary numbers and wondering if anyone else is thinking about this balance. I even included a couple of links to some peer-reviewed studies. I phrased it gently, respectfully, like the good girl I'd been trained to be. Then I watched the machine turn on. First came the silence, that weird, hollow absence where engagement should be. Then the slow turning. Friends unfollowed. A few messaged me privately. Are you okay? What happened to you? You used to be so positive. Like asking about children's well-being was a symptom of mental illness. But it was Sarah's message that gutted me. Sarah, who I'd known for a decade, who, despite only knowing me online, knew my fucking middle name and my favorite pizza toppings. This kind of misinformation is dangerous. I don't know who you are anymore. I read it 3 times, frowning, hard. It wasn't even misinformation. It was a damn question, backed by some studies. The betrayal hit first, a cold punch to the stomach. Then came something else. something that started as heat in my chest and spread outward like wildfire. My heart was pounding, palms sweating, like my nervous system was preparing for a fight I didn't even understand yet. Because I did know who I was. I was the girl who sat in church at least 2 times a week, in the second row. The one who smiled in family photos even when I didn't feel like it. The one who knew how to say all the right things, ask only the approved questions, and bury the rest so deep I sometimes forgot they existed. And suddenly I realized what that fire in my chest was. It was my voice, trying to claw its way back to the surface after 40 years of suffocation. But not everyone wanted me to find it. My parents were respected members in our church. My mom eventually worked there, which meant anything I did or said could reflect on her. And in our world, appearances weren't everything. They were the only thing. Not censorship, simply reputation. I learned early how to read a room, how to sense when my curiosity was crossing into dangerous territory. When I was 7, maybe 8, I raised my hand in Sunday school and asked why God would flood the whole world and kill all the animals when they hadn't done anything wrong. Seemed like a fair question to me. Still does. The Sunday school teacher got this tight smile and said, "God's ways are higher than our ways, sweetie," like that explained anything at all. Later, in the car, my mom's voice was quiet but sharp. "You can't ask questions like that. It makes people uncomfortable." "But I really want to know. Some things are better left alone." But the silencing didn't stop at theology. When I was 9, I asked why women couldn't be pastors if they could teach Sunday school. I was told that they actually could be, and seeing that backed that up, so I was cool with that answer. When I was 11, I wondered out loud why we needed to tithe 10% when some families in our congregation were struggling to buy groceries while the pastor drove a brand new car every 2 years. That last question earned me a lecture about honoring authority and not spreading gossip. But the thing is, it wasn't gossip. It was math, and the math didn't make sense. Each question was met with the same response, a tightening around the eyes, a quick subject change, and later a conversation about appropriate topics and respecting leadership. I learned that my endless curiosity was a problem, that wonder could be dangerous, that the safest thing was to nod along, even when nothing made sense. By the time I was 10, I'd perfected the art of the acceptable question. "What's your favorite Bible verse?" was fine. "Why does God let bad things happen to good people?" was not. "How can I serve better?" was encouraged. "Why do women have to be silent in church but men get to talk?" would get you sent to the car. I became an expert at swallowing the real questions, at smiling when I was confused, at pretending everything made perfect sense when it absolutely fucking didn't. So what made this worse? I couldn't actually stop asking questions. I tried, but my brain wouldn't cooperate. The questions kept coming, bubbling up like some unstoppable force. Still do. And that made me a problem. But the silencing started even earlier than church. It started in kindergarten with a brown corduroy jumpsuit and the most basic human need imaginable. I remember exactly what I was wearing that day, my favorite outfit with the little flower on the chest. I loved that jumpsuit. And then I had to pee. I raised my hand and asked if I could go to the bathroom. Mrs. Miller said no, not yet. We were in the middle of coloring, and she didn't like interruptions. But when you're 5 whole years old, when you have to go, you have to go. Your body doesn't give a shit about coloring, story time, or classroom management, or what's convenient for adults. I waited as long as I could, squirmed in my spot on my hard plastic chair at the big wood work table. The pressure built until it felt like my bladder might explode. I raised my hand again, more urgently this time. "I really, really need to." "In a few minutes." She didn't even look at me. Those few minutes felt like hours. I pressed my legs together, rocked back and forth, tried every trick a 5-year-old knows to hold it in. But my body had limits that Mrs. Miller's schedule didn't recognize. When it happened, the warmth spread down my legs faster than the shame could catch up. But the shame sure was quick. My favorite jumpsuit was soaked. The other kids started pointing and giggling. Someone wrinkled their nose and said, "Ew, gross." Mrs. Miller sighed like I'd personally ruined her day, like I'd chosen this moment specifically to inconvenience her. "Well, I guess we need to call your mother," she said, and there was something in her voice, disappointment mixed with irritation, that made my stomach hurt worse than my bladder had. I still remember having trouble catching my breath because I was sobbing so hard. I just wanted my mom. They couldn't reach my mom at work, so Mrs. Bowles from next door came to get me. I don't remember much about the ride home except sitting on the towel she'd brought, staring out the window, and the way my wet clothes stuck to me. But I remember the shame, hot and heavy and wrong, settling into my chest like it belonged there. When we got home, Mrs. Bowles helped me change clothes and then knelt down to my level. I thought she might be mad too, but instead she said, "That teacher should have let you go to the bathroom, honey. This wasn't your fault." It was the first time an adult had validated what I felt in my gut, that this wasn't right, but it was also the last time anyone would say that to me for a very long time. I was 5 years old and I'd learned my first brutal lesson about speaking up. Even when your body is screaming, even when your needs are reasonable, adults don't always listen. And if you speak up too much, or at the wrong time, or to the wrong person, you might get laughed at. You might inconvenience someone. You might get labeled as the problem. That was the first mark, and it carved itself so deep, I can still feel it. I spent the rest of elementary school being that kid, the one whose hand shot up at the worst possible moments, the one who asked, "But why?" until teachers ran out of answers, the one who noticed when stories didn't add up and had the audacity to point it out. In grade 2, during a unit on First Nations, I asked why we were celebrating Thanksgiving when settlers had basically taken the land from Indigenous peoples. My teacher, Mrs. Sterling, gave me the standard, "It's complicated" response, but I kept pushing. "But if someone came to our house and said it was theirs now, wouldn't we be mad?" She moved on to the craft project. I got sent to the principal's office for disrupting the lesson. By 4th grade, I'd figured out how to really stump them. During a science lesson about the solar system, I asked how we could know what space looked like if no one had ever been far enough away to take a picture of the whole thing. My teacher paused, blinked, and said, "That's a very advanced question." What she meant was, "That's not in my lesson plan, and I don't actually know the answer." The questions just kept coming. In math, why do we have to show our work if we get the right answer? In history, how do we know this actually happened if we weren't there? In literature, why does the author get to decide what their story means? Can't it mean something different to me? I wasn't trying to be difficult. I was trying to understand. But apparently there's a difference between the kind of curiosity that gets you gold stars and the kind that gets you labeled as challenging. Guess which kind I had? The teacher started using words like disruptive and argumentative. Parent-teacher conferences became tense affairs where I sat outside the classroom door, hearing muffled conversations about my attitude and my need to challenge authority. My parents got tired of the phone calls, tired of being told their daughter was too much, tired of having to explain why I couldn't just accept things the way they were. "Why can't you just do what you're told?" my mom would ask after another conference. "Why do you always have to make everything so complicated?" I didn't know how to explain that I wasn't trying to be complicated. I was trying to make sense of a world that kept giving me answers that didn't add up. I was trying to understand why everyone seemed okay with accepting things that felt fundamentally wrong to me. So I learned to carry 2 versions of myself. Pay attention to that 2 versions thing for later in the book. The one who asked questions anyway, and the one who knew those questions made me a problem. But inside, I was torn between 2 impossible truths. I couldn't stop being curious, but my curiosity was clearly a problem. I think the irony is devastating when I look back on it now. I thought my curiosity was my superpower, but everyone around me treated it like my fatal flaw. I had critical thinking nailed down before I even knew what to call it, but in a world that wanted compliance, critical thinking looked a lot like rebellion. And maybe it was. Maybe asking why is always a little bit rebellious. Maybe refusing to accept things just because someone in authority says so is the most dangerous thing a kid can do. 40 years later, sitting at my computer watching my pandemic post disappear into the digital void, I felt that same hot shame spreading through my chest, the same bewilderment, the same question that had echoed through every silencing since kindergarten. What's wrong with me for noticing this? But this time, something was different. This time, I had the words for what was happening. I was 5 when I pissed myself because I couldn't get permission to meet my own basic needs. I was 7 when I learned my questions about God made people uncomfortable. I was 10 when I realized that my need to understand the world was going to be an even bigger problem than my bladder ever was. And I was 44 when I finally understood that the problem was never me. The problem was a world that preferred obedient silence to inconvenient truth. A world that would rather watch children suffer than admit their systems were flawed. A world that called my voice dangerous because it threatened their comfortable lies. That day in kindergarten, sitting in my own urine, watching adults treat my basic human need like a personal failing, that was where it started. That was the first time I learned that my voice was dangerous, that my needs were inconvenient, that the safest way to exist was to take up as little space as possible. The first mark. And it left a scar that would shape every relationship, every decision, every moment of silence for decades to come. But what I know now that I didn't know then is every time they silenced me, they were protecting themselves. Every time they called my questions inappropriate, they were revealing their own fear. Every time they made me feel like I was too much, they were showing me exactly how little they could handle. The virus of silence had infected my whole life, but viruses can be cured, and I was about to learn how. What's actually true? Natural curiosity isn't a character flaw, it's a sign of an intelligent, engaged mind trying to understand the world. But when that curiosity is repeatedly shut down, when questions are treated as problems and needs are seen as inconveniences, a pattern forms. The child learns that their authentic self is too much, too demanding, too difficult for the world to handle. They learn to make themselves smaller, quieter, more convenient. What starts as a teacher saying "not now" to a bathroom request becomes a lifetime of believing your needs don't matter. What begins as "don't ask so many questions" becomes decades of staying silent when you should speak up. The trauma isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just a slow erosion of the belief that your voice has value. What questions have you been afraid to ask out loud? What need have you been dismissing as too much? Right now, in this moment, give voice to the one thing you've been keeping quiet. Even if it's just a whisper to yourself, "I wonder," or "I need." Your curiosity isn't a flaw. Your needs aren't inconveniences. Permission slip. I give myself permission to ask questions that make others uncomfortable. I give myself permission to need things without apologizing. I give myself permission to be curious about the world around me, even when it's inconvenient for others. My authentic self is not too much. She's exactly enough. I am allowed to wonder. I'm allowed to question. I am allowed to need things. I am allowed to take up space with my curiosity and my voice. Say this until you believe it. Your 5-year-old self deserves to hear these words. This week, ask one question you've been holding back. Express one need you've been minimizing. Notice how it feels to use your voice instead of swallowing your words. You survived being silenced. Now practice being heard. Every time I visit or revisit this part of the story, the origin point, I'm struck by how quietly these patterns form. Not in dramatic ways or not in big life-changing events, but in these tiny, almost forgettable moments that we have through our lives, right? It's stuff that we never think to bring up in therapy because it feels too small or not traumatic enough. But that's the thing, the nervous system doesn't measure size, it measures impact. Even the smallest moments can leave a crater if the lesson attached to it is deep enough, right? There's a psychological concept called foundational trauma. Those early experiences that set the blueprint for how we navigate the world. We often think that trauma needs to be dramatic or violent or even newsworthy. But sometimes it's just a 5-year-old in a brown corduroy jumpsuit learning that her body's needs don't matter as much as her teacher's schedule. And if you're reading this or listening to this thinking, Jesus, that's harsh for a kindergarten story, you're right. It is harsh. But what I wish someone had told me then, your needs matter, your voice matters. And any adult who makes you feel like shit for having normal human needs, they're the problem, not you. 5-year-old me needed to hear that, so maybe you needed to hear it too. One thing I want to highlight, because it comes up again and again in the messages I get from listeners, is how early many of us learn to override our internal signals. We're trained out of them before we even know the word boundary means. And then we grow up wondering why we freeze in conflict. Why saying no feels dangerous. or why asking a question feels like breaking some invisible rule. Psychologically, that's called conditioning through relational pressure, not punishment, not abuse, just pressure. Enough of that subtle force that a child learns parts of me are inconvenient. And once you internalize that, your whole life becomes a careful negotiation between who you actually are and who the world taught you to be. Make sense? As adults, we often mislabel this as people pleasing, or not wanting to rock the boat. But really, it's just survival logic. The version of you that learned that blending in kept you safe. And what's wild is how many grown adults are still living out strategies designed by a 5-year-old or their childhood self. Not because they're weak, but because nobody ever told them that conditioning wasn't truth. What I learned later in my psychology studies, this split is called adaptive dissociation. When your authentic self isn't safe in your environment, your brain kind of creates this false self to protect you. And it is a brilliant survival strategy, but it's also exhausting as hell. If you're living with multiple versions of yourself, the real you and the acceptable you, it's not weakness. It's just your nervous system trying to keep you safe. And the goal isn't to eliminate all your protective strategies. It's to create environments where your real self can exist without danger. Make sense? Something else the chapter brings up, and this is a big one, is the fear around curiosity. We like to pretend that curiosity is celebrated and that questioning is welcomed, but in real life, nope. Curiosity can be disruptive. It exposes contradictions. It pokes holes in systems that depend on obedience, both in institutions and in families. I mean, these days you get called names. You get called a conspiracy theorist for asking a damn question. It's wild. And when a child learns that a simple why can destabilize the room, they don't stop being curious. They just go underground with it. So if you were the kid, who asked too many questions or who couldn't just accept things because that's how it is, if you got labeled as difficult or challenging, listen to me. There's nothing wrong with you. You had what psychologists call intellectual curiosity and critical thinking skills. Those are gifts. They're not flaws. The critical thinking being a huge-ass gift that you should never let go of. The adults who couldn't handle your questions weren't protecting you. They were protecting their own damn comfort zones. Your mind was doing exactly what healthy minds do, seeking truth and making connections and refusing to accept accepted bullshit. Don't you dare apologize for that ever. A lot of adults listening right now are carrying years of underground curiosity. Questions you weren't allowed to ask, and truths that you weren't allowed to name, and needs that you trained yourself not to feel. Every time the world goes through something chaotic, a pandemic, a crisis, a cultural shift of some sort, those buried questions come back up. And that happens not because you're suddenly difficult or suddenly different, but because stress cracks whatever mask you've been holding in place. So, yeah. This is why you see people unravel during big world events, right? It's not the event, it's everything the event touches. For some, it touches old abandonment, and for others, old fear, and for others, like many of you listening, it touches old silencing. And when that happens, the emotional volume gets cranked right the fuck up, not because the moment's new, but because the echo is ancient. I learned something else working in psychology too. When something in the present triggers an intense emotional response that seems bigger than the situation warrants, it's usually because it's activating an old wound. Your nervous system is saying, whoa, I've been here before, and it wasn't safe. If you felt that same recognition during the pandemic, like I did, or during any time when your voice felt dangerous, trust that response. Your body remembers what your mind might have tried to forget. I also want to talk for a quick second about the way relationships shift when you begin using your real voice. This is something listeners write to me about a lot. When you stop being the agreeable version of yourself, the version that kept everyone comfortable, some people won't recognize you. They'll accuse you of changing, kind of like Sarah did with me, right? And in a way you have, but not in the direction they think. You're not losing who you were. You're recovering who you're supposed to be before you were quieted by the world. People who only knew the edited version of you will panic when the unedited version arrives, not because you're wrong, but because you disrupt the roles that they depend on. Here's a little something that nobody tells you about finding your voice. It's fucking terrifying. Not just for you, but for everyone around you who got stupidly comfortable with your silence. When you start speaking up after years of playing small, some people will act like you've committed a damn crime. You haven't. You've just stopped being who they needed you to be so they could stay comfortable. If you're in this place right now where speaking your truth is costing you relationships, I need you to know that the people who can't handle your authentic voice were never your people to begin with. Full stop. And that's where grief comes in. Because finding your voice is empowering, yes, but it's also a loss. You don't just lose people, you lose identities, you lose coping patterns, the comfort of invisibility, you lose the safety of not being seen. One more thing I want to leave you with today, because it matters. Your body remembers what your childhood self was never allowed to say. And anytime your adult life bumps up against an old emotional bruise, your nervous system does what it always did. It alerts you. That alert isn't dysfunction, it's just communication. So if you're someone who still hesitates before asking a question, or still apologizes for having needs, or still feels that, that humming anxiety in your chest when you speak a truth that might make someone uncomfortable, that isn't immaturity, it's simply history. And the moment you become aware of it, the moment you name it, you're already shifting it. So before I wrap up this commentary, let me offer you a simple reflective prompt. I like giving one per episode because these moments, these stories, they're not just mine, they're portals. They touch your life in ways that only you can interpret. So your invitation this week, ask yourself, where did you first learn that your voice was dangerous? What was your kindergarten bathroom moment? Because we all have one, that moment where we learned that our needs and our questions and our authentic self was somehow too much for the world to handle. Identifying that moment is not about blame or wallowing. It's about understanding where your patterns started so you can choose different ones. Your 5-year-old self deserved better. Your adult self can give them what they needed then. And also ask where in your life right now are you still asking for permission to be human? Permission to need something, permission to question something, permission to feel something. Just observe it. That's all. Awareness is the first step back to your voice. And this season, that's what we're doing. I'm not teaching you how to find it. You already have one, but I'm helping you unbury it. Thank you so much for being here. Please make sure to follow me wherever you listen to me, so when new episodes come out, you'll be notified. Remember that all episodes of Unbound are free. If you want to support the production costs, you can find me at ko-fi.com/unbound podcast, but there's never any obligation. This content will always be free because barriers to healing should not ever be financial. All support and contact info is in the show notes. And if you join the Facebook group, we sometimes have further conversation there, as well as giveaways and other fun things mentioned in off-script episodes. I will see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Unbound with Beth Curry. Join the conversation in the Facebook group or visit author.bethcurry.com. Want to support the show? Head to ko-fi.com/unbound podcast. Until next time, stay unbound.